I'm back on good old Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but I'm running the game under HDR now. I'm using an RTX 3090 for reference. Got it connected via DisplayPort. I've tested with HDMI, very similar. Haven't tested with my AMD GPU yet, but I will give notes as usual in the vision review if I notice any differences. I would expect it to be very similar on that though. So I'm going to just jump straight into the figures, the brightness figures. I know that's what many of you like to see. So this very busy looking graph, what it shows are different white patch sizes, percentage of pixels. Some reviewers will refer to this as percentage window, window size, white window, various different things. But what this means with this test, you have a white box in the middle of the screen surrounded by pure black. And the white box either covers 1% of the pixels, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49%, or 100%, which means there won't be any black on the screen in the case of 100%. Some of these lines, I've just put them in for reference, but you can kind of ignore them because they're not really useful in the real world. The first example of that would be the top line there, the sort of medium blue line. That shows the ASUS PG27AQD-M with its 8200K color temperature setting. So that's not very useful. It gives a very cool look. I mean, some people will find it okay, I guess, but it really gives a dodgy balance to things, and it can be visually very fatiguing, especially with the kind of brightnesses you can get under HDR. But it is there to show what kind of brightness is this particular panel, because they use the same panel, the LG and the ASUS is actually capable of. The LG has a similar setting or an equivalent setting, and that's the purple line, and that is Gamer 2. And when you use Gamer 2, it does boost the brightness because it sets the monitor to a very high color temperature. It's similar to the ASUS. I measured around 9000K on both of them. So the same things I said about the ASUS setting with the high white point applies, but also on the LG you have this really zany oversaturation on that mode as well. They've made things look very weird. And be aware, with all of my testing here, I'm using the latest firmware available on the LG. Also, you will note that I measured up to 910 nits with this weird, useless Gamer 2 setting, which most people aren't going to actually want to use, but still useful for reference, just to be aware of capabilities of the panel, LG versus ASUS and all of that. That is quite a bit higher than some other reviewers will have measured. That's because I have a different test methodology. I use a YouTube HDR brightness test, and I use what I call true peak brightness. So that is the highest brightness recorded at any point during the test for that particular patch size. It isn't just because the monitor peaked at 910 nits very briefly and then went down. It actually could stay at this for quite a while, and I redid the test a few times, and this is what I got. A few of the other reviewers will be using Kalman's pattern generator, which is different. That will take the reading at a very specific point in that test, and for whatever reason the monitor just wasn't peaking that high in that particular test at that point. But you know, it is what it is. Anyway, I would really not pay too much attention to this line. The one I would pay attention to is the navy blue line, the bottom line there, and also the orange line. That gives you a reference. That is the Dell Alienware AW3423DW with its QD OLED ultra-wide panel, and it's using its HDR Peak 1000 or Peak HDR 1000 mode. So basically you can see that the LG does certainly lag behind when it comes to brightness at a sensible setting, which gives the proper calibration and around 6500K white point. And that is comparable to the Alienware, which also has a similar kind of white point, and of course the ASUS using its 6500K setting. That isn't to say it's super dim or anything like that, but just comparatively speaking, if you're used to brighter HDR performance, then yeah, it is a bit limited. And I will give some real-world examples of all of this. Also, it can be a little bit confusing if you look at this graph because there's a crossover point. So for example, at a 9% patch size, the LG is actually brighter than the QD OLED. But then it crosses over again by 49%, where bright shades really dominate. And for a full white screen, 100%, the QD OLED is dominant again. But with any of these OLEDs, there is a ABL automatic brightness limiter, which is why the graphs start off much higher than they end up. So that is to say that the screen does dim when brighter shades dominate on the screen. Anyway, I've had enough of that graph. I'm going to go through some particular scenes in games. I will be flicking between a few different scenes and actually a few different games, so apologies if this becomes disorienting, but I think it is helpful to run through various different scenarios when you're talking about HDR. So it's HDR10 that's used. you have 10-bit color processing that enhances your nuanced shade variety. It allows the monitor to put its exceptional luminance precision to good use as well. It allows it to use its generous gamut well. So lots of advantages to the 10-bit color reproduction compared to your standard SDR content, which is almost always 8-bit. And that's really very standard for games under SDR. So it gives you an enhanced nuanced shade variety for these very dark shades, and because of the per pixel illumination, it can show tiny little very dark elements right next to very bright elements, or even just slightly brighter elements, whatever it might be. Excellent precision here. So much better precision than LCDs can give, even if they've got a mini LED backlight. So they would typically have 500 to 2000 dimming zones, whereas this monitor gives you several million dimming zones. So a big difference. And now back on that scene that I showed you when I was talking about contrast and SDR. Under HDR, you get exceptional depth. Now, it really does display pure black or very, very dark shades that are just very slightly brighter than that. And the level of detail is much better actually under HDR as well. The nuanced shade variety helps, and the monitor doesn't have the kind of slight black crush that I mentioned under SDR, under HDR. I mean, there is a little bit there. I'm not saying that it's perfectly displaying every single shade exactly as it should look, but honestly, it is so much better than what I would see in this particular scene and ones like this with this nuanced variety of dark shades than I would see on mini LED solutions. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but I do talk about dark biasing when I talk about mini LED monitors, because their dimming zones have to make a compromise where there are mixtures of shades, because although this will look like pure black on the video, there are actually little subtle details which you can see by eye. So the per pixel illumination is really helpful there, being able to display appropriate brightness for those details and appropriate brightness for the really dark shadow detailing as well. And then for the brighter shades as well, again, immediate transition, so I don't see a halo as I'd usually see on mini LEDs around the bright elements there. You can see a halo of light. I mean, that's just my torch that Laura's got, and it will just look like a big ball of light because of the brightness levels. But in practice, there's an excellent immediate transition between the brightness there and the darkness there. Really nice. And the same with the HUD elements. No haloing to worry about there. I'm going to dive into the water. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know I like to show this next little scene here. Again, the per pixel illumination is really helpful. The 10-bit color processing is also helpful. Just going to adjust the camera exposure so I can sort of roughly show you that this isn't just a giant ball of light. There are really nice smooth gradients. Again, you can't see this in the video as you'd see to the eye, but nice smooth gradients, so it can really help where the effects look nice and smooth with natural progressions of shade. And at the same time, nice variety of medium and dark shades. Even the tiny little shadow details there, really nice depth to them, with appropriate depth to the medium shades as well. It's actually very well calibrated under HDR, this monitor, in terms of its shade depths, its PQ curve, if you like to talk about that. I do have to talk about the glint of light on the water, because that is a very bright element in this scene. Now, there is a posterization effect. I mentioned this in the ASUS review. The reason for that is not because the monitor is badly calibrated or anything like that. It is a physical limitation with the subpixels of the monitor. It isn't quite as obvious as it was on the ASUS, and that's because this element isn't quite as bright, because I showed you the brightness isn't as high as the ASUS, and that applies to this particular scene for this element as well. It's not quite as bright. You know, it's a few hundred nits less bright, but it's still pretty bright, pretty eye-catching, especially if you're in a dark room as I am now. So don't think that this monitor looks dull under HDR. Now, of course, people have different experiences, different expectations of this, but it's really so much better than what most LCDs will show you under HDR. I'm not talking about the mini LED solutions here. I'm just talking about your sort of bog standard so-called HDR experience on an LCD. This monitor does give nice bursts of brightness that are far beyond that. And because of the per pixel illumination, it gives really nice depth as well to the surrounding medium shades, the immediate transitions and surrounding dark shades as well, depending on the scene. So that really does help them stand out a bit better than you might expect. But yes, of course, the ASUS does have an edge, and the QD OLED monitors do have an edge in this respect. But anyway, sorry for going off on a bit of a tangent there. The posterization, the reason for this is that the monitor has that white subpixel, that unfiltered white subpixel. And this is used for the brightness of the monitor, and it really dominates under HDR and it dilutes the image. So very little light is being shone through the red, green and blue subpixels compared to that unfiltered white subpixel. So you look at this element here, you can't see this on the video. I have quite a nice capture actually in the written review if you're interested in the HDR section, just sort of embedded there where I talk about posterization, showing this exact element. And you can see that it has weird layers to it. Basically it has a bright solid white core, pure white core. Then it has sort of pastel shades of various different colours, sort of different warm shades surrounding it. It should appear much more blended than that, but the problem is that the white subpixel is providing the brightness. The monitor therefore can't provide strong saturation at the same time. I will give some more examples. I was going to say better examples, but different examples of this a little bit later on as well. In fact, why not do that right now? So this scene, I showed you this with the PG27AQDM as well, the ASUS OLED monitor. And I did mention a few issues here. The LG does share these issues to some extent, but actually it's a bit better than what I saw on the ASUS. So if I think about this scene as I have seen it on some of the mini LED solutions and also the QD OLEDs, you get this really nice intensity to the red shades and the orange shades. It's because you get that saturation and brightness at the same time. On these WOLED monitors, the LG and the ASUS, you kind of have these pure white elements. It is a warm white, but where it has strong brightness, it doesn't have the saturation at the same time. It isn't necessarily so obvious when you're just looking at the lava here, but where you look at the flames here, and there is another example here, the flames at the top and bottom. Again, you can't see this on the video. I do apologise. It just looks like a giant ball of light because there is a lot of brightness coming out here. It has that white core going on, and the yellows and the oranges, the strongly saturated shades, are not bright. The bright elements are just sort of pure or warm white. With the lava here, it looks better than on the ASUS. I'm just going to adjust the exposure to try and show you a little bit of what I can see. There we go. So on the ASUS it kind of just looked quite flat and almost pink, quite weird. On this LG there are some stripes of pure white. They should be more yellow and intense orange than they appear. There should be some bright, slightly red element as well, or rich oranges, reddish oranges. But you don't get that here, but you do get some nice saturated orange and reddish elements combined with brightness, which is this sort of warm white. So it kind of works. It's better than what I saw on the ASUS, but isn't quite how it should look. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm running the game under HDR. This scene here can look super impressive on some mini LED monitors. I like to refer to the ASUS PG32UQX as really sort of setting the benchmark for brightness performance and amazing bright scene performance in scenes like this, because it can pump out extreme brightness levels, and it shows that sun and the glints on the icy surfaces there in an amazing way. With the OLED, as I showed you with the numbers earlier in the graph, it can't sustain high brightnesses where there's quite a lot of bright shade being shown on the screen. This is quite mixed. This is nowhere near 100% white window here. I'd say it's roughly half and half bright and darker shade. But either way, it's enough for the ABL to kick in on the monitor, and also it to kick in a variable way. So the sun there is brighter if I have it just a little bit of the sky showing versus if I have a lot of the sky showing. But the difference isn't as noticeable or as abrupt as on the QD OLED monitors. So with the QD OLED models where the ABL is more aggressive, it kicks in more aggressively sooner as bright shades start to dominate. There's really a more noticeable dimming. And because this is starting from a lower base really, there isn't so much of a shift. In a way, the monitor performs kind of well for scenes like this because of the consistency. There are some scenes where the ABL is more notable, and I will talk about that very shortly. But in this particular scene, and quite a few sort of mixed scenes like this, or mixed to brighter scenes, the monitor does pretty well in terms of its consistency. But again, the brightness of those bright elements, it's not exactly exceptional. You know, especially the glints down there, they just really don't stand out in the way they should. And the sun doesn't really have the eye-catching bright look it should have, and I'm in a pitch black room right now, so if you're watching this in daylight, or just a little bit of light in the room, then this isn't really going to be very impressive. Not saying it's going to look dull or dim, but just compared to what you can see in some models under HDR. Cyberpunk 2077. So this scene has an excellent mixture of bright and darker shades. It has a sufficient amount of brightness to show the ABL doing its thing, and also because I've got the HUD being shown on the screen, the HUD elements. Remember that the automatic brightness limiter doesn't just cap the brightness, it actually shifts the entire image so it's darker. Speaking of which, by the way, I just realised that you can adjust the brightness under HDR on this. It also doesn't just cap the peak luminance and neatly remap things. It will make things just look dull, kind of washed out in a way, especially if you make extreme adjustments. But the reason they do this is just for viewing comfort reasons. If you find it too bright, set to 100, then you can lower this a bit, just so it's more comfortable, because obviously viewing comfort is extremely important. There's no point in using HDR on the monitor if you're not finding it comfortable. And you'll see that a lot of the rest of this is grayed out. Contrast, gamma, color temp, RGB, all grayed out. You can, however, use VRR at the same time. So you can use adaptive sync, or you can use VRR, HDMI 2.1 VRR, at the same time as HDR on this monitor, and I have actually been using that whilst recording this section of the video. Now, with all that said, the ABL does kick in, but again, you're working from a lower base here. It doesn't go as bright as some of the other monitors, the Asus or the QD OLED monitors. So really the ABL isn't quite as noticeable, but if you look at those HUD elements, you will notice shifts. That's not just the camera. The camera is sort of adjusting a bit as well, but I notice this to my eye quite readily. And that's because there are just small bright elements there, which the monitor is able to pump out really reasonable brightness levels, not extreme brightness levels. You know, this is only ever going 600 nits or so max, unless you're using this horrible Gamer 2 setting. I'm just going to switch over to Gamer 2 actually. Why not? It looks disgustingly icy. There's extreme oversaturation. The yellow text there now looks orange. It's really quite disgusting and disturbing. I have to switch back before I scratch my eyes out, but it has increased the brightness. But either way, where these bright shades dominate, I'm using Gamer 1 by the way again, where these bright shades dominate, ABL kicks in, things are dimmer. Same scene in the darkness now, in the nighttime. So the neon lights here are reasonable in their brightness, but not as impressive as I saw on QD OLED monitors, and not as bright as I saw on the Asus either. Same with the moon there. It's pretty bright actually, which is why you can see a gigantic ball of light. I'll just adjust the exposure to try and show you. Looks a little bit more like that, but you can also see the details on the moon, the craters and all of that. So it doesn't just look like a giant ball of light. It's pretty bright, but not extremely bright by any means. And some of the neon lights, again, there's a lack of saturation, so the brightness here, I'm just going to have to adjust the exposure again. The lettering there, it looks more pastel than it should. The bluish lights up there as well, they don't have the levels of saturation they should have. And again, this isn't a calibration issue, it is down to the subpixel structure. And those headlights were pretty bright whilst I was getting run over just then. Okay, I think you've made your point, mate. The per pixel illumination as well, the precision there, really nice. No halos to worry about. I mean, there are some halos anyway, just because the game shows them, but the immediacy between sort of these, even these small bright shades in the background and the darker surroundings, really nice to see. Just sort of helps these brighter shades stand out a bit more than you might expect, given the actual brightness levels. So I definitely don't look at this, particularly in a dark room, and think, wow, this is really dim or dull HDR experience. It isn't the case at all. It does have some decent brightness to it, just not as high as some models. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, another scene I like to show. I was quite critical about the Asus on this scene. It did show impressive brightness here, and actually the LG does show impressive brightness as well, even though it's not quite as bright as the Asus was. And it does stand out nicely because of the fact that the monitor again has per pixel illumination. There's really nice depth to the darker shades surrounding here. And also really nice detail as well, nice subtle shade variety. Just a really nice 3D look to the rock textures there. Really very impressive look here. And the bright elements show a little bit of that posterization effect, but it's not as extreme as it was on the Asus. It doesn't really jump out at me, to be honest. If I was just not specifically looking for it, if I was just playing this game normally, it wouldn't really jump out at me. It wouldn't be something I'd really notice. I can see it, but it does have a little bit of a sort of silvery blue quality. There's a bit of a purple rim, and it should be a bit more blended. The sort of the bluish purple rim should have a little bit of brighter join with the silvery core, if you like. It's difficult to describe. Anyway, the way it's shown is quite decent, to be honest, on this monitor, so I'm fairly happy with how it's showing that. So definitely better than what I saw on the Asus for this particular scene. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction because that's another important aspect of HDR. The monitor's generous colour gamut is put to very good use under HDR. I measured 97% of the DCI-P3 colour space, and I'll just put that on the screen quickly just to show you again. So this isn't as generous as the QD OLED monitors, but it does offer good coverage of DCI-P3. And remember that under HDR, the game developers are targeting wider gamuts such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020 and even wider gamut. This monitor certainly doesn't offer complete Rec 2020 coverage, by the way, not as much as QD OLED monitors do, which still offer far from complete Rec 2020 coverage. So the QD OLEDs do have higher HDR vibrancy potential, and some of these elements did look more vibrant on the QD OLED. These blue flowers, for example, they had really nice pop to them. And remember, these aren't bright saturated elements, so the issues I was talking about before with the white subpixel aren't the culprit here. It's really more the colour gamut differences. Having said that, there is really quite nice pop. They don't just appear weird white as you see in the video. They actually do have quite a nice, almost luminous quality to them, but again, not as eye-catching as on the QD OLEDs, but more eye-catching than I saw on the Asus for this particular shade. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Asus and some comparisons. Now, I mentioned in the written review that some of these green shades, or green shades in general, looked a bit muddy as well, a bit duller than they should. Some of them looked quite vibrant, but some of them just looked a bit out of place. On the LG though, it shows these green shades quite nicely. Again, not quite as lush and vibrant as I've seen on some models with a more generous colour gamut, but really pretty good. Actually about as good as I'd expect given the colour gamut used here. And it doesn't have the issue that the Asus had with some of the shades being dragged down and looking a bit muddy, a bit brownish. Speaking of such shades, the orange and the reddish oranges of some of the dresses here, they're presented really nicely actually on the LG. On the Asus they looked a little bit muddy, and actually some of them looked oversaturated. It kind of depended on the scene and the lighting. Sometimes the Asus showed oranges like this as a bit too red, whereas other oranges weren't as eye-catching as they should be, so a bit weird. As I mentioned in the written review, you're not necessarily going to notice these issues on the Asus when you use it in isolation, but I did do some comparative testing with the LG and the Asus on the same day using the same scenes, and I certainly did pick up on these differences. I've also seen quite a few comments on my own videos and also on Reddit and elsewhere from people who were quite vocal about the Asus colour reproduction. They're not finding it very nice under HDR, but the most vocal complaints seem to be from users of the NVIDIA RTX 40 series. Remember, I'm using an RTX 30 series. There can be some inter-unit variation as well. So I'm not convinced that people were seeing exactly what I was seeing on the Asus. The issues I'm talking about here, yes, there were issues. You know, some shades did certainly look a bit off, but the way that some people describe it as looking completely washed out, that I think that is perhaps a different issue. And I've also noticed that Asus has mentioned in some of their firmware updates making optimizations for the RTX 40 series. So that makes me think that perhaps there is some difference with the RTX 40 series on that particular model. I'm not sure, that's just speculation. And either way, the LG does provide the superior colour performance under HDR. And yes, Asus may be able to tweak that with some firmware updates. I would really like to see that actually. We're just comparing what I saw on the Asus with this LG. The LG still does have an edge. And this yellowy orange shade here as well. Another nice example where the LG just shows a bit of a livelier look to things. And it's not lively as an oversaturated, because remember, the developers are targeting these wider gamuts. It's really just looking as it should. The skin tones as well, suitably toned down. They don't have that oversaturated, overly rich look that you get using the full native gamut under HDR, neither does Lara with her lovely skin there. So it's really just that the elements that the developers want to look vibrant do look vibrant. Again, not as much vibrancy as I saw on the QD OLEDs and some of the mini LED solutions with a more generous colour gamut than this, but still definitely vibrant and more impressive than what was shown on the Asus. So, I mean, it's kind of difficult to compare the Asus to the LG. Yes, the Asus does have superior brightness under HDR, particularly if you're comparing both models with sensible colour temperature settings, so settings which deliver around 6500K. But the LG has an edge when it comes to colour, and also remember that the higher brightness does invite more of that posterization which I talked about, and the sapping of saturation, the more pastel look. Both models suffer from that, but because the brightness is even higher on the Asus, you're more likely to see that, and it's more extreme in some cases where it does occur. So I don't really agree with some reviewers when they just say that the Asus is outright better under HDR. It really just depends on what you value in your HDR experience. And either way, I prefer the QD OLED ultra-wide HDR experience, particularly on my AW3423DW, which is very nicely calibrated under HDR. But even so, really what the LG is providing here is just well above average in terms of HDR performance.